Okay, so as promised, I'm now going to unpack the Tyler Vela versus Matt Dillahunty presuppositional apologetic debate. And a couple things I'll say before I start. Part of the reason why I started investigating presuppositional apologetics to begin with, which I've said a few times on my videos, of all the argument for gods, okay, that's a different type of debate than, here is an argument for the existence of God that I've seen Matt Dillahunty in. There's only two that I saw that put any meaningful points on the board, Tyler Vela and Jay Dyer. And they both ran very, very similar arguments of the presuppositional apologetic. Now, I'm going to unpack his argument. If you've been paying attention to my channel, I'm going to explain to you the mechanics of the argument. It's a really, really, really pretty good argument, actually. Tyler Vela, if you watch this, I'm doing you the profound honor of unpacking your argument. If I'm a little rough with it, take it in stride, because this is actually a compliment. I think it's really strong, really good argumentation, but it's not perfect. And my version of this is a lot simpler and more precise. And as we shall see, I'm going to say that if you scale back the ambition of both this argument and the Jay Dyer argument, you really have a game changer, something to put on the table that ultimately is really, really powerful, and the atheist is going to have to grapple with. Now, let me play it first, and then I'll go into my little spiels along the way.
Thank you for having me. So today I'm going to take the question of the debate in its broadest sense, one that I hope Matt would actually agree with, and that is whether or not there is any good reason to believe in God. To begin with, I will answer this question as to why I think belief in God is reasonable. That is, why there is good evidence to believe that we live in a God-full rather than a God-less cosmos. I will then respond to common atheistic objections to this position from commonly held epistemic standards. Also, as a matter of preface, let me start by saying that I'm not attempting to appease the logical positivists and the empiricists in the audience. This is because those who think that we should try and only accept and believe what can be empirically or scientifically verified are not only accepting and believing a standard that cannot itself be empirically verified and thus inherently contradict their own stated evidentiary standard, but also they make a simple category error in their demand for exclusively empirical evidence for what would be, if true, a non-natural fact. So let me first state that I simply reject the demand for me to play on their epistemological field with their specific evidentiary constraints.
Now, he plugs this in right at the beginning, so he's basically saying, you can't be a logical positivist. I've explained numerous times in my video why logical positivism fails. And the other thing that I'll mention in passing is that a huge chunk of the atheist community are, in fact, logical positivists or too close to the position for comfort. I'm not sure about whether he should have put it in right at the beginning of the argument, because Matt Dillahunty draws on this almost immediately to change the point of the debate to some degree about what constitutes good evidence, which is one of the things that Matt Dillahunty almost always wants to talk about. It's going to be his core. I really want to get to some of the back and forth, so I may cut out some of Matt Dillahunty's opening statement. It's pretty much standard Dillahunty. If you watch a lot of Dillahunty debates, everyone's going to pretty much know, this is what constitutes good evidence and things like that. And, I have a tendency when I make these things to talk a lot. Yap, 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 yappity, yap, 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 as you can well see right now. So I want to get into the back and forth a little, so I may cut out some of Matt Dillahunty's opening statement. Now, Tyler, again, if I'll wait till he makes the argument, and then I'll unpack it.
To their chagrin, I'm sure. Now, to my positive case for God, let me lay out a syllogistic argument that will be the framework for my statements here. I take it that the argument is demonstrably valid, so it will be the truth of the fact or the value premise with which Matt will want to challenge, I'm sure. The argument is as follows. Number one, if God did not exist, then no transcendental facts of reality could be coherently affirmed. Number two, we can coherently affirm transcendental facts of reality. Therefore, number three, God exists. Now this.
Okay, I'm not entirely certain if I'm crazy about the way he framed the argument. And I'm definitely really not good with the scale and the ambition of the argument. But do you get the gist of it? Okay, the core argument here, and this is, if you're an atheist, this is the core argument. What is the status of immaterial objects? And more importantly and more precisely, what is the status of immaterial objects given atheism? Now, every atheist ultimately, and atheists may object to this, but you will see that I'm telling you the truth. Ultimately, every atheist is going to have to answer this question in one way or another. Why? For we got three smart philosophical atheists who are already ahead of the curve and understand this. And as I pointed out in the other videos, one of which, Emerson Green, spooky naturalist, is what he calls himself. So he is calling himself, in essence, something that is an epistemology that accounts for the transcendent category that he has already acknowledged exists in reality, as Matt Dillahunty is going to acknowledge exists in this debate. This is a lot easier of an argument than people realize, because almost every atheist, including Matt Dillahunty, really obviously in this debate, really easily will say, yes, the laws of logic exist, and go on to define them. They're transcendent, immaterial, invisible, other than matter and motion. Okay, do you already see where that's potentially very inconsistent with atheism? That's the core point. The status of immaterial objects is a core philosophical argument going back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And in general, there are only a handful of strategies to how you deal with them in general. You basically I'll try to be brief with this because I don't want to get too complicated. Basically to a Platonic realist or a nominalist. A nominalist is saying a transcendent category exists, but in name only, so it isn't really there. Okay. In general, anytime an atheist, this is just a core thing to understand, anytime an atheist, including Matt Dillahunty, is going to assent to, in principle, something that is immaterial, invisible, transcendent, other than matter and motion, that is already, in principle, inconsistent with atheism. Does everybody understand why? You should understand that. That's not too complicated. And Matt Dillahunty is going to agree with it. Then he's going to try to agree that the laws of logic exist, then try to soften that position to make it actually more consistent with atheism. And this is the point. Ultimately, I'll go into that as the three people I've mentioned in the past. Thomas Nagel, who are already on this page and understand this and are trying to work this out and reconcile this to atheism. Emerson Green, spooky naturalist. Eric S. Reinhardt, Platonic atheist, and Thomas Nagel, who is as of yet undefined. Now, Tyler Vela is going to refer to Thomas Nagel in his opening argument in a way that I totally disagree with. I like his argument, and he understands the core philosophy really well, and he does a really good job in some ways, but his argument is too ambitious. You scale it back, and he shifts the burden of proof back onto himself, which I'll show you really obviously, and that's a big mistake. Because the real issue here is, what is the status of immaterial objects given atheism? That's the real core issue. And whether I'm there to argue that or not, that needs to be ultimately addressed by the atheist, period.
Might be too deductive for Matt. And since I'm not here really pushing for a kind of Cartesian or absolute certainty, let me attempt to make a much more modest, abductive version of the argument. And that's merely that if we can coherently affirm transcendental facts of reality, then it is most plausibly because God exists. A transcendental fact.
Okay, then that's basically true. One of the things you've heard me say 1,000 times now, they can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. What if they all say exactly the same thing? And every single solitary theist framing says there's an unseen, immaterial, invisible world other than matter and motion that undergirds and interacts with the known visible material world. So in essence, every type of theist, be it polytheist, even Taoist, whatever, agrees in principle that there are to a form of the forms. The only thing we are debating, forms meaning Platonic forms, the only thing we're debating is what form they take. Okay? So it's easily reconcilable to any theist worldview whatsoever, the status of immaterial objects. It is not so easy to reconcile to atheism. Why? Because like I just said, it is in principle, inconsistent with atheism. Anytime you are admitting to something, I'll let him talk.
Not to be confused with transcendent, are facts that are preconditions for rationality. That is, in order for people to be reasonable, to use reason, or to reason about things, these facts have to exist and be true for that to be the case. Some examples would be the laws of logic, a disambiguation between the one and the many, the reality of the external world, the effectiveness of mathematics, the reality of the past, and so on.
Okay, so he lists off as I've said, my first critique when I run this version of this apologetic, you stick to just the laws of logic and mathematical axioms. If you run through the other transcendent categories, first of all, almost nobody's going to know what you're talking about unless they have a background in philosophy. And it's not immediately obvious unless you already know this stuff. Like Jay Dyer will run through, what is it? Universals versus particulars, the one and the many. He listed a couple of them, unity of personhood over time, propositions. If you don't actually know the philosophy, it's not immediately obvious why some of these things are put into the realm of transcendent categories. So one of the things I said in my last video, sometimes Jay Dyer will win a debate based off of this, and the atheist won't know. What you lost the debate, dude. I did. Where was I? You were right there arguing alone because the atheist doesn't know what he's talking about. Tyler Vela doesn't do that badly in here, but even a little bit, you got to scale it back in ambition and, to the best of your ability. It's really complicated ideas. I understand that. One of the core things that somebody said on this particular, one of the comments was, can I have some ranch with that word salad? Meaning that Tyler Vela just ran word salad. It's not word salad at all. But if you don't know the philosophy, it just sounds like big words tossed together. You have to kind of unpack it for the person, even a little bit. Matt Dillahunty, even though he gets a lot of it, you have to unpack it, especially for a layperson in philosophy. Now, as I said, I'm not dissing Matt Dillahunty for being a layperson in philosophy, so am I. But you have to unpack it for people that won't understand what you're talking about. So the guy who said word salad thought he was actually dissing the argument, and he just doesn't know the concepts at all. It'd be like me talking about what is it, quantum mechanics, the measurement problem in physics, and I talk about observation. The guy's like, word salad. No, it's not word salad at all. Dumb. You just don't know anything about quantum mechanics. I talk about interpretation of quantum mechanics, like word salad. Interpretations, yeah. I'm interpreting things just fine. That's how the level of this argument, you have to be careful when you run an argument like this, is that in general, the atheists aren't going to know what you're talking about. And they're going to come up with these imbecile objections, okay, because they don't know the philosophy at all, that makes sense in the moment, and you have to carefully unpack it. But they're going to be Matt Dillahunty do it? I don't think he does it, but in general, most atheists will do it.
Now, we all agree on the fact that we can reason. That's a functional common ground that we all share. If Matt and I didn't believe that, we wouldn't be here, and you all probably didn't come to see two men just sit here and emote at each other. The question is not if we have this common ground, but on what basis this common ground could exist in reality. The answer is transcendental facts. And these transcendentals that ground our ability to reason abductively entail certain other facts about what kind of explanations that they themselves might have. Let me use the laws of logic as an example of abduction from a transcendental fact. The laws of logic have the qualities of being transcendent, objective, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, abstract principles of true thought. To deny any one of those attributes is...
What's very interesting is he forgot inviolate. Matt Dillahunty himself offered inviolate. So Matt Dillahunty knows this well enough for him to understand the core issue that I'm going to bring up, okay? And this core issue cannot be avoided by the atheist community. Can't plead ignorance of this. Why? Because it's a real problem. If there are three type of people who understand this, and are three philosophers that I mentioned, who are trying, is Platonic forms consistent with atheism? Can it be reconciled to atheism at all? That's going to be the core issue. And it's not entirely clear that it can be. Okay? And if it can't be, bye-bye atheism. Bye-bye love. Bye-bye atheist. Hello, Jesus Christ. Give me all your tithes. That's my little riff on it. That sounds like a big, bold claim, Craig. I understand that. I'm a big, bold, tough man. I'm a big, bold, tough man, okay? Understand that sounds like a big, bold, tough claim, but it's actually the truth. Because as Matt Dillahunty is going to accept, yes, the laws of logic exist. Okay, that is in principle inconsistent with atheism. So you need to have an epistemology that accounts for that fact that you, the atheist, are in principle agreeing to something. Why is he saying the laws of logic exist? He has to. They exist as provable fact. He uses them all the time. I use them all the time. Tyler Vela uses them all the time. So they're there as provable fact. Okay? And Matt Dillahunty isn't going to deny that they're there. He's going to look for other strategies to integrate them with an atheist worldview. And I'm going to show you that this might not be achievable. Do you understand? I didn't say it all that clearly, but I think you can get the core point.
To effectively throw logic and any process or method built on them, like science, out the window. Why? Well, imagine that I said logic wasn't necessarily spaceless. This would entail that logic may only apply in specific locations in space. A person may then arbitrarily say the law of non-contradiction is true on Earth.
I'm not even sure if he should have done this. This doesn't. If you do this type of argument, you should try to keep it simple as possible. I don't think it needs to be. Maybe this is a good idea. I don't know. I'm not sure if this is a good idea to explain why the laws of logic are necessary. Because the more things you throw in there, the more you give the opponent the opportunity to change the subject. And Matt Dillahunty is really good at fixating in on something where he will have the edge in the exchange. So you want to keep it simple.
Earth, but not in orbit around Alpha Centauri. Not only would we want that person to justify such a radical claim, ironically by employing logic itself, but it would make the use of logic variant and violable. So imagine that some atheist named Joe believes that the concept of God entails a logical contradiction. Well, if logic were viable like this, it would mean that belief in God would be irrational on Earth, but potentially not irrational in orbit around Alpha Centauri. The same goes for the other attributes.
Right. The other example I've used is transcendent, meaning not bound by space and time. You know, if you A equals A today, you know, and you go back in time and you go, you know, A equals A 1,000 years ago, you can't go, well, wait a minute, Craig, that's a long time ago. Yeah, I understand. A still equals A. So they're transcendent. They aren't time bound.
Just consider for yourself what it would mean for the law of identity to be material. Or what about time bound? Could it be a contradiction? Could a contradiction be irrational today, but rational tomorrow? What about if the laws of logic are?
See, they are of necessity transcendent. So I guess there's a point in arguing this. Like I said, in one of the core atheist objections, which is an imbecile objection, like I said, if you are an atheist, okay, you can't just learn this stuff from other atheist videos because they aren't trustworthy sources of information. Because oftentimes they learn it from other atheist videos. So they just come up with easy outs that if you actually know the philosophy are imbecile easy outs. They do it with the hard problem of consciousness all the time. Oh, it's easy. Emergent property of the brain. Okay, that doesn't explain it. That just explains how it starts. That's not explaining whether it's in principle irreducible. That's one of the examples. Atheists do this all the time. If you're an atheist and you want to actually get good at this stuff, you got to go beyond atheist videos, other atheist videos. Why? Because they're chock full of disinformation. They don't know what they're talking about usually, and they pass on to the next atheist video stuff that's totally ridiculous, and nobody knows that. That's why the only atheist videos that don't do that, well, some don't do it, but the Answers from Reason crew don't do that. They don't do that. They don't latch on to gimmicky, dopey, fake ideas from the atheist community and pass it on. But a lot of other atheists do. Okay. It's a big, big, big thing if you're trying to deal with, really complicated stuff. You've got to go to source material.
Are objective or conventional. This is a big one. Well, if there's something that we as humans invented merely to help describe the world, this would mean that they are true. This would mean that they aren't true, that they just be useful fictions, sure, but still fictions. The implications of this are horrendous. Think of our atheist friend Joe, who thinks the concept of God violates a logical convention.
That's also for people who think fictionalist school of mathematics is totally incoherent. Math would not work under those grounds. There's transcendent, inviolate principles at play. That's the point. That's why these are good arguments to present to atheism. Why? Because once the atheist gets hip to that fact, and it's an inescapable fact they can't avoid, once they understand, you got to unpack it correctly, though, or they won't understand. Then they will see that this has to be reconciled to atheism, and it isn't entirely clear that it can be. So then what happens? Then one day atheism will vanish if it can't be. Why? Because it is a proposition that is in principle incoherent. Now, I'm not saying that's what is. I told you the people who understand this to some degree and are working on it. A Platonic atheist, Eric S. Reinhardt, a spooky naturalist, Emerson Green. Those are potential avenues of reconciliation wherein the atheist is attempting to reconcile the reality of a transcendent category that they are going to have to admit to some degree is there as provable fact to atheism. Can it be done? I don't know. If it can't be done, bye-bye atheism. Then you have to abandon the position. Why? Because it's at core, in principle, incoherent. Doesn't make sense with the world as it actually occurs. Didn't say that all that well, but I think everybody kind of understands what I mean.
And therefore shouldn't be believed. Well, imagine some group of theists came to agree with Joe that the God concept entailed a contradiction, and so just invented a new convention that overcame Joe's objection, or just scrapped the laws applying to God in the first place. Why ought the group of theists be subject to the man-made convention over another? They wouldn't. But Joe would expect almost certainly that they would be rationally blameworthy for that. That is, he would expect that the standard be applied not as a convention, but as an objective standard.
I don't think he should be going into why they're necessary and why. I think this is too complicated. I would try to cut this out. It's already complicated. Already the way I present it in my videos is really complicated. I'm aware of that fact. You should try to parse it down and make it as simple as humanly possible. What is the status of immaterial objects given atheism? How are you going to reconcile the fact that something like the laws of logic exist by your own admission? It is in principle, it is immaterial, invisible, transcendent, other than matter and motion. How are you going to reconcile that to atheism? Can it be done? That's a question, and just pose it as a question. The atheist doesn't have to answer it in this debate. That's the other mistake that a lot of the other, who's the Darth Dawkins, where he just tries to trap people. This isn't about trapping an atheist. This isn't about gotcha game. This is about pointing out to the atheist that there's potentially a real contradiction at the core of atheism. Why? Because in their ontology, almost every atheist is going to willingly admit that there is some transcendent category in their ontology, for example, a law of logic, that as of this hearing is not consistent with their epistemology, and it needs to be reconciled. Does everyone understand? It's a real argument, guys. It's not a word salad. It's a real argument, and it's a really important one for atheists.
That they must subject themselves to in order to be rational. Joe wouldn't think himself a conceptual imperialist imposing one possible convention on others. Joe would consider this to be the way the world really is, more so the way the world really, really is. And I think Joe is right. Moreover, the laws of logic are transcendent, and here I do mean transcendent, not transcendental, that they exist outside of the bounds of the natural cosmos, be it the universe or the multiverse, or however you define it. Why do I think this? Because if they were a feature wholly within the cosmos, then the cosmos itself would not be subject to them. This would mean that it could be the case then that the cosmos exists and doesn't exist at the same time and in the same way. Now, unless one wants to commit themselves to affirming the possibility of contradictions like that, it seems necessary that the laws of logic be transcendent. So what then do we have? A transcendent realm of objective, absolute, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, abstract principles of true thought.
Okay, so right there, what he just said was basically correct. Okay, I won't quibble with the phrasing. So this is why I said a Platonic atheist, that is an atheist who is admitting in principle that there is some form of a transcendent realm. Do you get why that's inconsistent with atheism? Does everyone understand why that's inconsistent with atheism? Do you get why the atheist has to do that? Okay, why does the atheist have to do that? Because the law of logic is something the atheist willingly admits is there. Why does he admit it's there? Because he has to. It's a precondition of intelligibility that he, in fact, uses to, formulate his ideas, just like Matt Dillahunty will do in his argumentation. So he is admitting for something in his ontology that needs to be reconciled to his epistemology. Can it be done? I don't know. If it can't be done, bye-bye atheism. That's the point. They got 3 philosophers working on it. And I don't know that they can be successful. What I was trying to ask Eric S. Reinhardt is, doesn't he get pushback from other atheists? And obviously he does, because most atheists are in really logical positivists. You got empirical evidence for your Platonic form, Greg. Got empirical evidence for that. Okay, this is beyond the empirical, cannot be empirically verified for, and yet it's there. So you see how that is potentially really inconsistent with atheism. Get it now? It's not that complicated, but you have to try to keep simplifying it. Keep simplifying it, because it's It's more complicated than your usual arguments. It's a little bit more complicated than most. Like I said, I've seen Jay Dyer and David Patrick Harry, when they run this correctly on all 5 cylinders, literally fry an atheist brain. Literally fry an atheist brain. But the key is it has to be a smart atheist. They can only fry the brain of an atheist who already understands what they're talking about to a large degree. They can't fry the brain of a dummy, all right? Because he has no idea what you're talking about. No idea what you're talking about. Word salad, Craig. Stephanie, you gotta no, I'm not Stephanie, you gotta use this argument. Weak sauce, Craig. Word salad. I kind of agree. It's word salad. No, it's not word salad, Stephanie. I'll teach you.
Remember, the laws of logic are rational principles. They're not laws of nature like gravity or motion. They are principles which ground, frame, guide, and correct thinking via proper inference. When we ask,
right, got prescriptive, correct, guide, thinking by proper inference, rules of inference. Because one of the key atheist objections that Matt Dillahunty is even going to say in this video is completely dumb. They're descriptive. No, they're not. They're prescriptive. A law is prescriptive by definition. It is a rule of inference. You violate the law, you have illogic or, logical contradiction. That's really obvious. The fact that atheists, even a smart atheist like Matt Dillahunty, is an intelligent guy, so he should know better. Why is he saying it? Because it floats around the atheist community as an easy out, and they don't recognize that it's dumb. Why? Because they don't really unpack and think about it. That's why I said the answers from Reason Crew can be trusted. Why they do stuff like this all the time. The atheist says XYZ PDQ, and they don't go, oh, okay, atheist said so. Aaron Ross said so, guys. That has got to be true. Almost all the other atheists do. Oh, this came from Aaron Ra. Okay, then it's got to be true. No, not necessarily. Aaron Ra is a fountain of illogic and disinformation and bad arguments. He's a fountain of it. He's a constant stream of bad arguments and yelling. You yell too, Craig. I do not.
Ask then what the possible basis for them could be. We categorically have only one real feasible option: a transcendent, objective, absolute, spaceless, timeless, immaterial, omni-rational personal mind.
Okay, this is where I object. Should not make this argument, okay, you can't explain this, atheist. Here we go, I can. God explains this. Why? You shift the burden of proof. And he starts now making it so that he can't win the debate. It's literally what happens, guys. Watch.
Why do I say this? Well, let me get some help from atheistic philosopher Thomas Nagel, who wrote an interesting book some years ago called Mind and Cosmos, where he argued that the epistemological program of naturalism has failed and failed miserably. And so Nagel proposed a new kind of way to understand the world, a kind of...
Okay, so Nagel has arguing that naturalism fails. Why? Because of transcendent categories, in essence, because it can't account for things. It doesn't account well enough for things like... but Nagel is trying to look for a path of reconciliation. Now, whereas what Tyler Vela is doing here, which is I think is a mistake, is he is saying you can't be like Thomas Nagel, Matt Dillahunty, whereas my argument would be a lot less ambitious. Matt Dillahunty, look at Thomas Nagel. You got to try and be like Thomas Nagel and look for a path of reconciliation between transcendent categories and atheism. Do you understand? Do you understand why my argument is much better? I don't shift the burden of proof back onto myself. There's no reason to do that. This is about atheism. What is the status? Keep it simple. What is the status of immaterial objects given atheism? It is a core question of philosophy that needs to be addressed by the atheists. And they need to reconcile the transcendent categories that all the ones like for Emerson Green, he's a spooky naturalist. So spooky naturalist. Woo! Woo! By the way, I think that's where the term woo comes from. Woo! It's woo! So he's a spooky naturalist. Okay, fair enough. So he's got something in his ontology that he is literally defining in his epistemology. So there's a consistency there. But ultimately, we have to ask, is that consistent with atheism? But that's up to him to try and work out. Give him 4 or 5 years or whatever. And if he can't work it out, abandon atheism. Why? Because it's inconsistent with the world as it actually occurs. You have to. Why? Because you, the atheist, say, I want to proportion my beliefs to the evidence. Matt Dillon probably say it in this debate. And I want to believe what's true. And I want to adjust my confidence to the facts. Okay, if I'm telling you the facts and I'm telling you the robust, defensible facts of the matter, you got to yield to me, not the other way around.
Non-theistic Neoplatonism. His argument is basic.
Non-theistic Neoplatonism is a really interesting way to reconcile transcendent categories to atheism. There's no reason for you to say, Matt Dillahunty, you can't do this. This is what I'd say to Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty, I'll give you three options. You want to say I'm a spooky naturalist, like a la Emerson Green. Matt Dillahunty, I'm a spooky naturalist, Craig. Okay, fair enough. Bait's over. Call it a draw. Matt Dillahunty says, I'm a platonic atheist, a la Eric S. Reinhardt. Or he goes, I'm unconvinced. I'm going to look for a path of reconciliation similar to Thomas Nagel. Okay, fine. Debate's over. Debate's over. Call it a draw.
Well, we have all these fundamental transcendental facts of reality like logic, intentionality, persons, minds, etc., which naturalism fails to account for, and theism can account for them, but we can't let theism be true. So maybe it's this Neoplatonic realm of abstractions. Nagel just arbitrarily doesn't allow the theistic explanation, but just as a matter of incredulity and not for any fact of consistency or coherence or evidence, just because. So he eliminates categorically all naturalistic.
By the way, Nagel gets plenty of pushback from other atheists. I told you about in one of my videos that Moving Naturalism Forward, the Sean Carroll convention, where he assembled literally a who's who of the best and brightest of the matter and motion is all there is crew. And he titled it Moving Naturalism Forward, which clearly implies he understands this to some degree. What that naturalism, as currently framed, can't account for the worlds that actually occurs. It needs to be updated. And persona non grata hangs over the room, Thomas Nagel, and they don't have kinds of things to say to him about him. They talk about him as if they're Democrats at a Trump convention. Trump, ew, Orange Man bad, That's how they talk about him. Why? Because he is more on our side. This is what I'm trying to argue. A philosophical atheist, a la Emerson Green, has more in common with me than he has with Aaron Ra. So does Thomas Nagel. More in common with me than he has with Aaron Ra. So does the Answers from Reason crew. A lot more in common with me than they have with Aaron Ra. Okay, Aaron Ra is the dummy here, and he's the one who's got to reconcile his worldview to the worlds that actually occurs. Does everyone get it? This is really powerful, guys, if you see it. I hope I'm saying this well enough to communicate the true pristine clarity and logic of this argument. But it's really strong, really robust. I think it's ultimately, I really do think it's a game changer.
Counts. He admits theism can account for these features of reality simply, but won't allow it. And so the only category left is a kind of Neoplatonic realm of abstractions. So
right, let the atheist find that weird middle ground, right? Say, Matt Dillahunty, you can find that weird middle ground too, and then I'll say you're fine for the time being. And then let that question percolate through the atheist community. Can that be reconciled to atheism? We don't have to settle it for them. We don't have to try to force them to see. There's no reason for that. Just get them to see the first part of the argument. What is the status of immaterial objects given atheism? Get them to see the first part of the argument. That's it. Much simpler.
Nagel says some version of that must be the case. But Nagel chops off his nose despite his face by denying theism and doubling down on an incoherent category like what he already rejected in natural.
See, he's having an argument with Thomas Nagel. And Thomas Nagel's going to win that argument. Why? Because Thomas Nagel's smart. And he's going to have robust justifications for the philosophical things that he lays down. Correct. And they're going to be really complicated, but they're going to be robust and defendable. You're in a debate with Matt Dillahunty. Matt Dillahunty's an atheist. Matt Dillahunty, you are right about to say, yes, the laws of logic exist. And they are transcendent, immaterial, inviolate, other than matter and motion. Why is he going to do that? He has to. Precondition of intelligibility, just like the presuppers say. Okay? So he's going to admit in his ontology something that as of yet is not included in his epistemology. Just show Matt Dillahunty that contradiction. That's it. That's the only goal. Scale back the ambition of these presuppositional apologetics so that they are just simple.
Because Neoplatonism just doesn't make any sense. It's literally incoherent. What does it even mean to say that the law of non-contradiction exists, not as a concept in the mind, but just abstractly as a thing unto itself?
See, he's debating Thomas Nagel. If you have a debate with Thomas Nagel about, how do abstract notions exist in time or in and of themselves, he's probably going to win the debate. Don't debate Thomas Nagel. Debate Matt Dillahunty.
How would such an abstraction causally interact with the cosmos such that the cosmos would be subject to it, let alone incorporate it into its fabric?
Don't push this argument further than the evidence suggests. Don't make it an argument for God. Make it an argument for to show an atheist that atheists too need to reconcile the world as it actually occurs. So they need to answer a core philosophical question that everybody else answers. What is the status of immaterial objects given atheism? The first silo from the atheist community, the skeptic community, began with Hume. It's called empiricism and the school of these things don't exist. You know, tried to relegate Hume's fork. I don't want to get too complicated, but I've talked about Hume's fork, where he tried to relegate a mathematical axiom and things like this to the status of you have matters of fact and relation of ideas. So relation of ideas. So it's not actually something extant to a human being transcendent in the world. So you can reconcile it to atheism. Do you see what's going on there?
Of being such that nothing can exist or be true within the cosmos that violates such a law. Nagel's Neoplatonic world just cannot possibly be an explanation categorically because it just is conceptually vacuous and incoherent. However, we do understand what a law of logic is conceptually.
I should skip this part.
Since it only posits one. Remember, we're seeking an explanation for various transcendental facts, and the Christian posits a single entity as an explanation for all of them. The atheist, however, would either need to deny explanation and appeal to brute facts, which I showed already doesn't work, or he would need to come up with some explanation for these transcendental facts by appeal to explanations that are not God.
There's some common ground here. Is there good evidence for God?
Since it only posits one candidate for all of these features, and thus would necessarily multiply explanations up to simplicity just isn't the only.
Thank you very much. Next, we will switch it over for Matt's opening statement. Thank you very much, Tyler.
I'm probably going to skip some of Matt.
Thank you very much. Next, we will switch it over for Matt's opening statement. Thank you very much.
I'll probably skip some of Matt Dillahunty's too, but I'm going to let him talk a little.
Tyler and Matt, thanks so much for being here. The floor is all yours.
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate Tyler being here. I don't know. I'm always interested to see if we can find some common ground, but I think Tyler may have undercut the possibility of some common ground here. Is there good evidence for God?
That was such a weird thing. I don't know why he said that right at the beginning. You know, maybe there's a reason for it. I don't think he's trying to play him. I don't understand why he said that, but.
This is a much better question than what we are often presented with, which is there evidence for God? And I, like many other people, have, in the process, human beings are subject to hyperbole. Will say, oh, there's no evidence for God. Well, that's not strictly true, in the sense that people constantly note, well, there's anecdotal evidence and accounts and things like that. And so it's much better for us to address, is there good evidence for God? Just as it would be a good question to ask, is there good evidence for any proposition?
This is like standard Matt Dillahunty. This could be an opening in almost any video, any debate he's ever been in. He doesn't actually. I don't remember if he even addresses any of the stuff that Tyler says in the opening. I don't think he does.
And so the question then becomes
standard Matt Dillahunty epistemology. What constitutes good evidence? Yada yada yada.
What makes evidence good? And here is perhaps where we're going to have our biggest disagreement, because it's easy to view this as a purely subjective exercise. It's difficult to define what counts as good evidence, and each individual is going to have some subjective.
See, a lot of what he's about to say is all true, sort of, but not relevant at all to what Tyler Vela just laid down, at all. And I'm pretty sure that he just made an opening statement. It's a generic one, so that's why, but
assessment of what they consider good. And the temptation is to merely base it on what an individual finds compelling or convincing. The problem is that we know that people can be convinced for bad reasons and with bad evidence. And the fact that we can know that means that we can assess things at least in a nearly unbiased fashion, or at least removing as much bias as we can, to say, this person has believed something for bad reasons, and that implies that we can identify the difference between bad reasons and good reasons. This is the foundation of why we dig in on epistemology, to find out how can we justify saying we know something, or that we are reasonably warranted in believing something. So imperfect and incomplete, it is an attempt to be as objective and unbiased as possible, something that we cannot actually do. I got to notice that my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully I didn't get cut off, but
yeah, you got cut off for a second.
we have not yet formed a perfect epistemology, but we've done a good job at eliminating some problematic issues. We've identified that if we put together logical syllogisms, we can identify fallacies. And if a syllogism is fallacious, that means the conclusion is unreliable. It doesn't mean the conclusion is necessarily false. When we're assessing,
so this is all like standard Matt Dillahunty. I would skip ahead, but I'm not exactly sure. There's a couple of things I want to make sure get said. So I'll just let it play for a bit, even though
people's accounts of things, which we seem to be limited by our sense information. And so I'm going to experience a world and you're going to experience a world, and we're going to try to communicate and relay what experiences we've had with that. Unfortunately, we know that people lie. We know that people exaggerate. We know that people
see this is not relevant at all. This is why it gets a little annoying, because this isn't even remotely relevant to the argument that was presented.
reach flawed conclusions, have sloppy interpretations, that we have bad memories, that we're subject to peer pressure and manipulation. This does not in any way mean that everything everyone says is wrong. It just means we have to. Testimony is notoriously bad. We also know that we're bad at understanding and relaying our personal experiences. See,
this is nothing testimony. He wasn't saying anything about, personal experiences. He wasn't saying anything about any of that.
Myself kind of.
I mean, I guess he should have, maybe they didn't talk ahead of time. I don't know. Maybe this isn't.
Paradigm is a great instruction, but the question is, how well can we actually know ourselves? So when somebody comes to me with an account of something that is supernatural or extraordinary, I'm certainly willing to believe that they had an experience and that they are honestly trying to accurately relay that experience. But that doesn't mean that the story that they are relaying is accurate, or that the conclusions that they've reached are.
I'm pretty sure these have been fashioned over time to be like very core objections to what he generally thinks the core argument is going to be against him, like a resurrection argument or yada, yada, yada. Because none of these address the transcendental argument at all. They're not even remotely relevant. And I guess he didn't talk to Tyler Vela ahead of time and find out that he's going to run a, transcendental argument.
Warranted. So when we're evaluating evidence, there's two components. There are the data, the facts that are presented, which are the evidence. And then there is the assessment of those to determine the quality and quantity of that evidence, and does it rise to the level of warranting belief in the proposed explanation that the evidence is for. So when the question of this debate is there good evidence for God, I have to look at this as if what are the points of evidence, and does this reliably point to the proposition that a God is the explanation? When we're evaluating evidence, it would be ideal evidence would be repeatable, independently verifiable, strongly tied to a specific.
Right, yada, 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 novel, testable, predictable results, blah, 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 blah. You've heard this standard spiel by a lot of different types of atheists.
Specific, discrete hypothesis.
Matt Dillahunty does it a little bit better than most people, but it's, pretty standard.
And our hypotheses cannot be vague, which is a constant problem of someone arguing for some nondescript theistic God as a foundation for something, and then moving from that to a specific God. There's a little leapfrog there. And ideally, it should be falsifiable. There should be some way to demonstrate that if this were not to be the case, to show that it is in fact not the case. The closer our evidence is to that best standard, the more reasonable it is to consider it good evidence. So, for example, if we're talking about something like causation, we tend to look for causes that are both necessary and sufficient. And amongst a potential set of causes, we look for causes that are proximal, both with regard to geography and time. We shouldn't rely on the butterfly effect, no matter how intriguing of a proposition it is, to trace causes back and back and back and say, oh no, this isn't Matt's fault. This is Matt's great-great-great-great-grandfather's fault, or it's the fault of a lizard in Matt's backyard that did this.
Not sure why he goes into this. I assume there's some type of strategic decision being made here, but I have no idea what it is. As I said, Tyler Vela ran a pretty good version of the transcendent argument. My version would be a lot different. Scale it back. Don't make it an argument for God. Make it a question posed to the atheist. How do you account for immaterial objects given atheism, which is actually potentially a real challenge? needs to be addressed by atheists as by everybody. It's not just atheists who need to account for him. It's just that theism generally really easily accounts for all things transcendent. Why? Because really, really obviously, compatible with theism. He's going into his standard, what constitutes good evidence, to novel testable. This is all basically Humean skepticism, Humean empiricism, evidence is novel testable predictions, methodological naturalism, blah, 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 blah. And when Aaron Ra rants and goes, I want evidence, I said evidence, this is what he's talking about. So Matt Dillahunty has enough integrity, okay, that he's going to originally try to scam Tyler Vela and say, what you just said was word salad. But Matt Dillahunty's smarter than that. He understands that there are laws of logic. He's a philosophical layperson, yes, but he does know the philosophy well enough to engage at this level. And he actually does it pretty darn well. So that's why I wanted to unpack the part where they're talking back and forth, because Matt Dillahunty, I'll show you exactly what he does to try and reconcile the laws of logic to atheism, and I'll show you why it potentially is not going to work. But we got to get there. We got to weed through. I don't want to cut off his opening statement just yet, because there's some stuff right towards the end, if I remember correctly, where he does address the actual argument, and I don't know how far into it I am.
That put him in this particular mood that we go for proximal causes. So when we're talking about evidence for a proposition, what we're doing is something far closer to determining causality, even if it's not a true causal relationship. It often is the case when we're looking at the evidence and then finding what the evidence points to. That's what we're claiming the evidence is for. So if we find a dead body and we start gathering evidence, those data are important. But the narrative we derive from that evidence is what we're talking about when we say evidence for a proposition.
He's going to try to run a scam a little bit at the beginning with it. He's going to back away from it, where he's going to say, you didn't really make an argument. And Tyler V is going to go, it's like, here's the ball, fetch the ball. There's the ball, fetch the ball. Like, yeah, I did.
The proposition being, here is the individual who committed this murder, or the way in which they committed this murder. There's an old adage that, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. But we know that's not always true, because we know that zebras exist as well. And that sort of abductive reasoning about trying to come up with the most likely explanation is at best spurious and or unreliable. And so we're just saying, hey, we have some reasonable confidence that if I'm in Texas and there's hoof prints, it's probably going to be a horse, but it could possibly be a zebra. The thing is, could it also be a centaur or a minotaur or a unicorn? Hey, unicorn. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, both in quality and in quantity, and something that points to a discrete, for example, unicorn hypothesis. Unicorns, by the way, aren't really outlandish, extraordinary creatures when you just consider the physical attributes. Essentially, we're talking about a horse with a horn. That's not only plausible, it wouldn't be all that surprising to find that, there are other horned animals that are closer related, that at some point there was something horse-ish-like with a horn, or that we might find something like that. It's the magical properties of the unicorns that move us well into the extraordinary. We aren't aware of a horse with a horn right now, but the hoof prints of a horse would certainly be consistent with a unicorn. And it's a mistake to say, here are hoof prints, this is consistent with a unicorn, and that somehow demonstrates the likelihood or the plausibility that there is a magical creature that is attracted to virgins and lives in the wood and whose horn has magical healing powers, or whatever else we're going to attribute to a unicorn. It's not enough to claim that the evidence is consistent with the hypothesis. It has to be discretely tied to the specifics of the hypothesis. And if we don't begin with a specific hypothesis, then we're already beginning with vagaries that can lead us far astray. Hoof prints are consistent with both horses and unicorns, but even if we found a horse with a horn, that doesn't.
I'm pretty much still assuming that this is standard, because so far it's still not addressing anything that was said.
Confirm the other claims about unicorns. So what about gods? What do we know about a god? What hypothesis can we have about a god that would allow us to set it up as some sort of discrete hypothesis that things can point to? Quite often, we don't get anywhere near a robust definition of a god. What we get is something vague or generalized, the God of classical theism with its various omnis, or some kind of abstract thinking mind that serves as a grounding for something, or the vague creator of order or the universe. And this plays itself out in conversations that I've had many times, which is like somebody's like, oh, look at the trees, as if looking at the trees is evidence for God, or look at order in the universe, or look at the laws of logic. And we get to a point where we have.
So, okay, so now finally he's somewhat addressing, but he's saying that what Tyler Vela said was equivalent to look at the trees, look at the laws of logic, God exists. That because of the laws of logic, God exists. So, okay, now we're getting to really like somewhat addressing in like an almost ludicrously condescending fashion.
Have something for which we would like to have an explanation. We don't necessarily have an explanation. We can't.
That's going to be big. So he did listen, and now he's going to tie in standard Matt Dillahunty epistemology to we don't have an explanation, something we'd like to have an explanation. So his core argument is starting to be set up finally. Yeah, that was a slog listening to that whole spiel about evidence and what constitutes good evidence. And that was a slog. But now finally we're getting to a core counter argument. Okay, so he's setting up now finally his argument. Finally, he's setting up to say, I don't have to care. I don't know why the laws of logic exist. I don't have to account for them given atheism. That's going to be the core.
Come up with a better explanation, and that people go leaping towards.
But that's partially the fault of Tyler Vela, because he framed the argument as, atheists can't account for this, which is where it should have begun and end. That's the beginning and the end of the argument. Atheist, you use the laws of logic. Therefore, Matt Dillahunty as fact that they are there, transcendent, immaterial, invisible in your ontology. How do you have to reconcile them to your actual epistemology? That's it. That's the argument. Don't say we Christians can because we have God and here's God accounting with blah, because then you're going to have to explain all that. And that's not the point of this apologetic. The point of this apologetic is to demonstrate to the atheist clearly and concisely that there is something missing from their epistemology, from their worldview, that needs to be there and present and accounted for. Why? Because it's actually there in their ontology. That's the contradiction. It's something they use and make use of, and hence willingly acknowledge is there as fact, but it's not there in their epistemology.
A God. Oh, well, how are you going to ground your morality? How are you going to...
Does everyone get why that's strong? Does everyone understand why that's strong? That is a potential really, really important contradiction at the core of atheism that needs to be reconciled.
Reason reliably, unless there's some God serving as a foundation for this. There must be something nondescript at the beginning. Personal accounts and testimonials are often also used. It certainly counts.
Gosh, it goes back to testimonies and personal accounts. What on earth? He didn't say anything about that.
As evidence. The problem is that you can accumulate as many of these as you want, and you don't get to the standpoint where we have good evidence to believe something. Personal.
That's got nothing to do with anything, dude. Get to the point.
Accounts of things like, well, God delivered me from alcoholism, and I certainly couldn't do it on my own, fall into the Dumbo's magic feather category. How do we know that, in fact, you could not do that on your own? How do we?
Okay, I'll address that just in passing, because God did deliver me from alcoholism. And he says, well, how do we know it was God? That's really the wrong question to be asking. I went to church. I became a Christian within a year, promise. Within a year, I had stopped drinking, stopped smoking, and more or less stopped doing drugs, except weed every once in a while. And I was more or less a functional alcoholic. And I would not be alive today if I had kept smoking. I smoked about 2.5 packs a day. So the asking, how do we know that's God, is ludicrous. Or it's not ludicrous, but that's not the right question to be asking. The transformational power rumored to be present in a Christian experience was very much present in my own life. And it has been very much present in my life the whole time. So that is by definition miraculous. Yeah, you can explain it through naturalism too. But if you find some sort of naturalistic thing that works for you to that extent, to the fact that like you were basically, not going to be a functional adult, you were going to run into trouble, and you found something that actually helped save your life through naturalistic means, then grab onto that naturalistic means thing that you found and cultivated and defend it. Hello? So to say, God delivered me from alcoholism, how do we know it's God, is the wrong question. Maybe it wasn't God. Maybe it's naturalistic. Maybe it was the church environment, and this has something to do with it. The fact that there was a loving environment there, and I felt, peace of mind for the first time in my life, for real peace of mind for the first time. That all might have had something to do with it. That doesn't matter.
Know that a God intervened. What do we know about a God, and how do we infer what it can or cannot do? How do we know what it wants or what it does? How can we tell if it's interacting with reality at all? If people look at and interpret things within reality as if it comes from a God, how can we show that there's a strong tie from the observed evidence to the discrete proposition? If we go to abductive arguments, we have to have a way to determine a list of candidate explanations and to understand that we have ruled out certain explanations so that we know we have a candidate.
Honestly, I didn't realize he went on with this stuff this long. It's, even if he wasn't prepared for Tyler Vela's argument, he should have cut this stuff short, because this is not relevant at all. It's not even close. It's totally just going through a standard Matt Dillahunty spiel about, like, if somebody says I had a religious experience, well, how do we know what constitutes? Did you really have a religious? If someone said, the resurrection argument, well, it's based on testimony. He's going through a standard counter-apologist spiel for, like, random arguments that were not presented to him in this hearing at all. And this is totally a waste of time. So why is he doing it?
Candidate list that is as close to exhaustive as we can get. We have to have a way of determining which of those is more likely. We can't just say, oh, well, we haven't come up with a naturalistic explanation, and therefore this justifies us leaping to supernatural explanations. We need some data to determine how often the proposed X is the cause of the effect Y, in order to make a determination of how likely something is as a cause, or how comparatively likely the probabilities are that this is the better explanation. I don't know how anyone could do this with a God, where we have no confirmed examples of a God ever doing anything. It's all inference. It's all unfalsifiable suspicions, appeals to ignorance or abstractions. So I'm not aware of any good evidence for God. I'm not aware of anyone demonstrating that there even could be good evidence for God or for anything supernatural. We don't have a mechanism by which we could explore supernatural causation or intervention. We don't get to just say, hey, we haven't found a natural explanation for it, so therefore my supernatural explanation is possible, plausible, likely, or proved. The entire history of apologetics is one of trying to mold arguments and evidence to the conclusion that someone has already reached, an attempt to prop up a God hypothesis that is ill-defined, malleable, and unfalsifiable. Is it more likely that we're desperately trying to ease our discomfort with not knowing, or that there is in fact a God who's playing an amazing game of hide and seek, playing favorites with private revelations, and staring at a world that has no coherent model of who that being actually is? If there were a God, that God should be able to easily provide good evidence. And by that, I mean evidence that nearly anyone would consider good evidence. We wouldn't have to have any discussion about whether or not, we're not going to be able to provide empirical.
Yeah, that's exactly where we're heading, though. I mean, once upon a time, we didn't have any good evidence for cancer prevention or how diseases were formed in the body. And then we started to learn things, and we started to apply things like the laws of logic and like empirical investigation, and get better at inferring and get better at processing our thoughts and having rigorous standards of justification. So we got better at learning those things and unpacking them and finding out how they ticked, as we are starting to do now with God. For a long time, apologetics was on hold. Why? Because there was no reason to do it. Back in the day when, this is my own pet theory, but back in the day when Thomas Aquinas was formulating arguments for God, it was more of a parlor game. Why is there no atheist? It was like, if I were charged with proving God, what would I do? It wasn't until the rise of these guys, these people influenced by the Four Horsemen, that atheism presented any type of real challenge or any type of, do you have evidence? Do you have justification for believing in God in a meaningful way? Prior to that, atheism was a very minor, wasn't really a thing until, going back, I'm maybe going back 200, 300 years, but you know what I'm saying. So the idea that we don't have any evidence for God at present tense or any good arguments for God, present tense, doesn't mean we aren't coming up with things that are going to be, very, very good, strong evidence in the days and months and weeks and years to come. Apologetics hasn't stopped. It doesn't begin and end with the Kalam.
Evidence. We're not going to be able to provide material evidence. We're not going to be able to do this sort of testing. We wouldn't have to have an argument about what qualifies as good.
And by the way, any honest skeptic, any honest atheist should be challenging themselves too. I'm sorry, that's par for the course. You can't just say Christian, let me do street epistemology on you and challenge the things you believe. Do you have justification for them? Atheists should be doing the exact same thing. And they've been trying to say that they don't have to. You're the one making a positive claim, Craig. Okay, no, wrong. Wrong answer. This is why this is a powerful argument. It's getting the atheist to examine the core of their presuppositions. Go, are these coherent and robust and defensible? And do they make sense given the world as it actually occurs? And there's a reason why this is more important, or why I've latched onto this. Okay, you take your standard argument like I was just watching the Pine Creek Flying Man, argument for the resurrection. As I've said 1,000 times, it doesn't matter what evidence you lay for Pine Creek about a resurrection. Why? A naturalistic explanation to Matt Dillahunty or Pine Creek is by definition 100 times more plausible than any supernatural explanation. Why? Because that's how they roll. And then they say, well, resurrection's wildly implausible. It is not wildly implausible if you start off with the presupposition about a God where you believe in a being that is awesomely powerful and able to do exceedingly abundantly above all you say and ask. Then it's not that heavy of a lift. It's not wildly implausible. It's as wildly implausible as, today when I'm done with this, I'm going to pray before my wife gets home that she makes a good dinner. A mundane prayer. Sometimes I actually do pray, make a good dinner today. Said that she's fun. And pray that she's fun. Even that right there, that's a really mundane everyday prayer. Okay. That's presupposing a being of awesome power. If he could do that mundane thing, he could easily raise someone from the dead. It's not that much more implausible. I get to the atheist, both things are implausible, but that's why we need to take the atheist presuppositions about reality and say, look, do these actually make sense? Because if these don't account for the world as it actually occurs, dude, then it's time for you to make shifts. It's not just us. Do you get it?
Evidence.
Please wrap it up.
If there were, in fact,
It's
the
really
kind
important.
of omni God or the classical theism God
Blah, blah, blah,
that
blah.
Tyler and others are advocating for, there would be no need for a debate. Suggesting that good evidence already.
It's not true. Okay, that's a thing that atheists say all the time. The Bible literally says, surely you're a God who hides his face. So if there is a God, okay, put an if qualifier anytime you're an atheist. If there is a God, hiding himself is part of the agenda. Why? Don't know. So we can burn everyone to hell, Craig? I don't think so. So we can send everyone to hell. He's terrible. Look at the Old Testament.
Exists is essentially suggesting that non-believers are a mix of unintelligent, dishonest, or delusional. And while that may be true for some, it certainly doesn't ring true.
And if the cap fits, let them wear it. No, I'm just playing. Plenty of smart atheists.
In the larger sense, especially when you consider that the proponents of the purported good evidence gods don't seem to agree on what the evidence is or what it means or what God it points to or the character.
Right, and there's 50 different interpretations of quantum mechanics. That's not relevant to the truth value of anything being discussed. These arguments aren't really arguments. These are obfuscations. Granted, when people call the Matt Dillahunty dodge is perfectly appropriate if somebody is in this context right now. This spiel at the beginning is long-winded and it's tedious. He's basically going through a whole host of objections to things that aren't being presented. What is being presented is a transcendental argument, okay? And so he should have cut some of this out.
Characteristics of that God. And many believers scoff at the very idea of providing evidence for a God and suggest that it's merely a faith-based position that cannot be proved. So while I was interested in hearing what
I guess this is part of his strategy. I don't know. This just occurred to me that you bring up 50 different objections and then, you're kind of making it harder for the Christian because they're going to feel compelled to answer one or two of these. Because, I got to try to prove God to back Dillahunty. I guess that's why he's doing this, because I don't understand why he's doing this at all. We all know his objections to other things. Why is he going through a laundry list of them? when he's been presented with an argument and going on with it for a long time? I don't know.
Tyler would consider good evidence, and whether we can come to some agreement on how good it is or isn't. It seems that we've started off with, hey, I'm not going to be providing anything that Matt or other people would actually consider good evidence because this thing is in a different category. And that's absolutely fine to say that it's in a different category, that it doesn't fit in with
Okay, that's not what he said.
these particular rules. But then you have to come up with a mechanism by which you can show that the evidence you're presenting counts as evidence and not just inferences, because you want there to be some grounding or foundation for something that you haven't even demonstrated has one. Just that if it doesn't have one, oh no, we can't count it reliable. Because if God serves as the foundation,
That's actually like, you know, I don't know if I can fully unpack this right then and there, but what he just said is actually really bizarre because, oh no, these things do need a foundation, otherwise they aren't reliable, is part of the history of mathematics and is part of the reason of why Gödel's incompleteness theorem was necessary to begin with. Something transcendent to the system itself is required to ground the system, or else if you rely on the formal logic of the system itself, you could literally prove a lie. Now, I've explained that in other videos, and I didn't want to unpack it here. But what he just said was actually seemingly good logic to him, but utterly fallacious. And that's utter fallaciousness, is the fact that he doesn't really know some of this stuff as well as he ought.
for logic, and God can, as Tyler said, create these laws, then it would.
So I didn't mean to confuse everybody. In other words, he just said, oh no, I don't have grounding for this. That's a really important question. And he just acted like that's not an important question. That is an important question for the atheist and for the theist and for everybody. That is a really, philosophy is not just words and, word salad and stupidity. If there were no philosophy, there'd be no science. And you need to do philosophy of science in order to understand the findings of science. And as I pointed out in the other video, okay, the physicists are clear. The holographic principle, for example, the physics are settled fact. Okay, what Leonard Susskind says is that a hologram is something akin to a hologram. So now it is the purview of the metaphysician and the philosopher to come in and unpack and tell us what this all means. Why? Because it's not the purview of the scientist. What they do is build model to predict outcomes. The scientist is Carlo Rovelli and really smart and wants to do it, go for it. He's a good philosopher. He's a really good philosopher. So, but what he just said was utterly fallacious.
Would seem reasonable that God could then change these laws, which means there is no reliable grounding there either. That the only thing you have is confidence that, hey, there's a God as a foundation and he's not going to change this stuff. And yet you still haven't done anything to demonstrate the subject of the debate, which is there good evidence for God? Essentially what we've started with is, I'm going to throw out everything that would normally be considered good evidence for reaching a conclusion. I'm going to deny you.
No, he said he's not going to derive a conclusion from empirical investigation. And then he gave you the example of something, a transcendent category that can't be investigated or decided by empirical investigation. And God is in the transcendent category. So the whole point of the argumentation is contrary to what he's saying right here. Okay? The whole point of the argumentation. Here is something that is in principle irreconcilable to atheism. Why? Because it's beyond the purview of empirical investigation, has no spatial temporal locality. It is invisible, immaterial, transcendent, other than matter and motion. Most of the atheists say only matter and motion exists. And yet here's something that they're in principle agreeing exists. Why? They have to. Matt Dillahunty is going to use the laws of logic in his argumentation. How can you reconcile it to atheism? Is it reconciled to atheism? That's the question.
Your epistemology, I'm going to then insert an abductive argument because that's what will work best for the thing that I'm trying to argue for. And, this is why I think we may be stuck, because whether or not Tyler or somebody else accepts that, I cannot accept that as good evidence.
You bet. Thank you very much, Matt, for that opening statement. Now we will go into the 60 minutes of open conversation, setting a timer just to be sure we stick with that 60 minutes, and then we'll go into the Q&A. So, gentlemen, thanks so much again for being here, and the floor is yours.
You want to start?
Yeah, sure. A couple thoughts. I mean, I was trying to frantically write down as much as I could, because there was a lot of I don't mean this in a bad way. There was a lot of kind of scattered thoughts that I'm not sure I heard a.
Yes, standard Matt Dillahunty objections to things other than this argument. Standard Matt Dillahunty objections. They're interesting, I guess, in and of themselves, but not relevant to what was said.
An actual argument all the way through. The first half, I'm not sure I really disagreed with much. Besides the implication that you wanted to draw from it of a kind of logical positivist empiricism, the use of logical fallacies and reasoning and all, there's not much I disagreed with. What you're doing is,
it's funny because he's gonna accuse Matt Dillahunty of being a logical positivist a few times in this debate, and Matt Dillahunty is going to take, not great offense, but it's going to take offense to that. It's a little close to logical positivism. That's the point. That's the point. Almost all atheists, most atheists are too close in spirit, in principle, to logical positivism. If logical positivism is the philosophy most consistent with atheism. And it, in fact, says the only meaningful statements that are ones that can be empirically derived for. The problem is logical positivism is really obviously self-refuting. So it came and went. And that's the point. Is atheism in the same category as logical positivism? Why? Because there are things other than matter and motion, transcendent categories exist as provable fact. Can they be reconciled to atheism? If logical positivism were true, atheism would be true. And, atheists would be, like I said in the other video, atheists would be collecting my tithes instead of the other way around. Greg, give us your tithes. Then atheism would have been true. But logical positivism came and went. And if atheists don't find a path of reconciliation for immaterial transcendent objects, I think atheism is in the same, potentially, a position that will have 20, 30, 40 more years and then ultimately be unreconcilable to reality, to the world that actually occurs. This is a lot more important of an argument than you people realize. Why? Because I'm telling you the God's honest truth. There's only 3 people I know of who are trying to reconcile Platonic forms or abstract objects, immaterial objects to atheism. Said them already a few times. Can they? The success of atheism depends entirely, even though this is going over the heads of most atheists. Okay, it's going over the heads of almost every atheist. Not the most atheists listening to me is smart enough to understand this. The Joe and Luke crew, Emerson Green, Shannon, they're smart enough to understand this stuff, but it's going over the heads of most of those goofball clowns out there. The baby girl goofball, godless, what's her face? Godless Liz, forget it. This is why I'm saying Godless Liz is absurd. Do you think Godless Liz could even follow the argumentation here? But Christians are so dumb. Oh, they're so dumb. They believe in talking snakes. Okay, she couldn't even follow this argumentation. She would say, literally, word salad. Word salad. What he just said is word salad. It's not word salad at all. It's a foundational question that needs to be addressed by the atheists.
What it seems to me that you're doing.
Smarty pants atheist, heed the call. Pick up the cross and follow me, Craig Reed. You need to address this. Doesn't have to be today, doesn't have to be tomorrow. I mean, the main mistake that I think I'll unpack the Shannon Q versus Dart Dawkins just for fun. But the main mistake he makes is he says, you, the atheist, have to address it right now in this hearing, or make God exist. It's absurd. Matt Dillahunty doesn't even have to address it in this debate. He can say to me, if I were in the debate with him, he could say, Craig, you're right. I'm going to be a Platonic atheist, like Eric S. Ryan. Okay, debate's over. Let's talk about something else. Okay, fair enough. And then ultimately you come back to him in 3 or 4 years and go, can that be reconciled to atheism? Don't know. The answer is not clear. It's not clear. That's the point.
Is kind of like playing, I don't mean this pejoratively, it's kind of like playing fetch with the dog, where you throw a ball.
He did mean it pejoratively.
The dog go gets the ball, and I'm saying, okay, I threw the ball, and you're saying, but that's the ball. And I say, great, but I threw you the ball. And you say, but that's the ball. And I say,
right. Matt Dillahunty originally tried to dodge the argument as if he didn't make one, and he did. And Matt Dillahunty knows that he did.
Great, but I threw you the ball, right? So you're pointing to that common ground of reasoning and logic in the process. And my argument is, okay, that's all well and great. That's the common ground I conceded. The question is, what is the possible foundation for those? And are they true I'm hoping you're interested in what's true and not merely what's pragmatic.
Interesting side note. I don't want to get too into the weeds, but I think Tyler Vela just indicated that he was a foundationalist. The Jay Dyer crew are coherentists, and that's a very big difference. So they'll say that their argument is not reconcilable to foundationalism. They complain about foundationalism a lot. I'm sympathetic to the complaints. I'm not sure if I agree with them, but
yeah. So, and so this is why, and I took a bunch of notes while you were talking. We're in agreement. Let's just say we're in agreement that we'll just stick with identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle as the foundations of reason.
Awesome. You see? Yes, the laws of logic exist.
The thing that I'm not convinced is that anyone has demonstrated that there is or could be some justification or some foundation behind that, because you'd have to show that this isn't just the way things are. And I understand that it would be nice to say,
I love you.
We have shown that this is an inviolate foundation. I just don't see how we can actually get there, because one of those things where you would have to assume they were true in order to use them in the first place. And so,
okay, so he just basically quoted Gödel's incompleteness formulation. You have to assume the axiom in order to use the axiom, which applies to. So Matt Dillahunty's agreeing, yes, the laws of logic exist. How do I know that? I use them all the time. So do you. They're the foundation of, clear thought. What was the thing Tyler Vela said? They're tools of inference. So we use them all the time. I acknowledge these things exist.
rather, you're taking.
Now you see why I said Tyler Vela blew it. He made the argument about, look, I got the good foundation, you don't. So he assigned himself the burden of proof unnecessarily. Everybody understands, every philosopher everywhere understands that transcendent categories are really obviously a lot more compatible with theism. Really obviously. Everything transcendent in theism goes together like hand in glove. Okay, a lot more compatible. What they are potentially not compatible with at all, can't be reconciled to, is atheism. That's the whole point. So make that the core argument. And you don't even have to actually have a debate with anybody to get this out there. Why? Because the smarty boots atheists already know that this is a thing and they're already working on it. And if they can't reconcile it, that's it. Then it's like logical positivism. Comes and goes. Had its brief moment in the sun where we're all like, that Richard Dawkins was such a smart guy. That Sam Harris was so smart. Sam Harris is trending towards theism as we speak, by the way.
An extra step in saying, I think we have described something that
Oh, yes, he is. Don't you tell me otherwise.
is, these.
Oh, no, he's not, Craig. Stephanie, what are you doing? Huh? Sorry.
Transcendence must exist in a timeless, spaceless realm. Well, that is a step further than I can go, because I don't look at them as extant things or don't see the need to create a separate realm.
Okay, you get it? Now you see the core argument. The laws of logic exist. I don't look at them as extant things to a human being, so I don't see them as needing to exist in anything like a Platonic realm. So Matt Dillahunty does get this. So his original, you didn't really make an argument, was smoke. Okay, he does understand this, and he does understand what the argument is, and he understands to some degree that this is a real thing that atheists need to deal with.
Because imagine there was nothing. Hey, and I realize this is incredibly difficult. Now we're going into universe from nothing crap, which I'm not going to do. But those things would still be true, because nothing is nothing. It's not nothing, and everything is either nothing or not nothing.
Right. So he's using the law of identity to make an argument, formulate as a tool of inference to make an argument and show you why the argument is correct. In other words, they are prescriptive. You violate the law of logic, you have illogic or logical contradiction.
Those things would also be true in any realm that I could imagine, and they seem to be true.
Do you see why this is a powerful argument? Matt Dillahunty, the atheist, is trying to admit that they exist and now has to answer weird questions. How do they exist? Is there a transcendent realm that they're part of? Well, that's theism. isn't it? Now, Eric S. Reinhardt says he's a Platonic atheist. I don't know how he has a Platonic realm. That's why I said that's why I was trying to get him to say, first of all, justify his Platonism. I think he sensed I was going to use it against atheists. That's why I didn't give you the answers. But, doesn't he get pushback from other atheists? Because as soon as you start going into this transcendent realm, Emerson Green's going to get pushback from dummy atheists. Yeah, those atheists are dumb. Great, I understand that. But he's going to get pushback. Those atheists are really dumb. Great, I just totally understand that. I understood. Atheist Green is an intelligent guy. Emerson Green's a good philosopher. He's a really good philosopher, actually. Counter-apologetics, meh. His philosophy is excellent, first rate. I've cited him. I've cited him in my work. I've cited the dirty atheist. Like, he's good. He knows what he's talking about. That's the real question here. How is this guy, Matt Dillahunty, admitting that a law of logic, a transcendent immaterial thing, sounds kind of icky and spiritual already, doesn't it? Yes. Where is this thing? In some sort of transcendent realm? Okay, that's theism, isn't it? Yes. Those people who argue Platonism and theism are irreconcilable is ridiculous. Theism and Platonism are totally compatible. Every form of immaterial thing is compatible with theism. It's not potentially compatible with atheism. That's the point. And now that I'm explaining it a little better, everyone sort of understands why this is powerful, correct? How do you reconcile this to atheism? Look at him struggle. Look at him squirm. Look at him struggle.
Whether or not there is a God. And so the curious thing is that if you think that God can create these laws of logic, can God change them?
Okay, a gimmicky side point. That's why you can't make it an argument for God. Because then he goes into a gimmicky side point. Atheists ask dopey questions like this all the time. I'm not saying it's a dopey question from Matt Dillahunty, but it's totally beside the book. God can change the laws of logic. So this is where you bring up a moral argument for God. Everyone goes, what's a stupid Platonic thing? What's that stupid thing? Could God command? Did God command? I forget. It's escaping my brain. The God divine command theory, is it good because God commanded, or God commanded because it's good? So he's trying to take another common atheist out. Let me talk about something totally irrelevant, a theological abstraction that seems to favor atheism. Why? Because you can ask a lot of confusing questions about it. Atheists do this all the time. And if you're an atheist doing this to yourself, by the way, just because you are thinking about something in a way that makes it seem really incoherent and pretzel logic doesn't mean is in fact is. Atheists do this stuff all the time. Most of the time you're doing it to yourself. Why? Because most of these questions ain't all that groundbreaking or interesting or important. They're irrelevant. They're irrelevant. They have no relationship to ontology whatsoever, promise. And atheists think they're arguments. Why? Because they do dopey stuff like this. Oh, is it if God creates the laws of logic, then they're arbitrary.
Yeah, so
it sounds like philosophy. It isn't.
I think, let me try to help. I think there might be a slight misunderstanding in how you're understanding not only the concepts that we're dealing with, but the argument that's being made. Because you said a couple of things like, oh, well, you basically cast the argument.
He doesn't misunderstand, but Tyler Vela is going to try to bring it back home. He doesn't misunderstand. He gets it. He said enough right there in that little piece until he went into God create laws of logic to get it. He gets it. I promise. He's a smart guy. He really is. And those of you who, underrate his intelligence, debate him. He'll kill you. Debate him. Watch him win. But he definitely understands it because he went right to some of the core things. Extant to the human being. That's a word that he borrowed from actual philosophy. Okay, that's not a word that just appeared to him to use. He borrowed that from actual philosophy. Why? Because that's the core question. Are they there's only two outs for an atheist. Are they descriptive or prescriptive? The descriptive is a dumb argument. They're prescriptive a law is prescriptive by definition. It is a tool of inference. That's a dumb argument born of, you watch too many other atheist videos, so you don't really understand philosophy. That's a terrible argument. But the other argument is on firmer ground. It's what I've said. I don't think I said in this video, but I said in other videos. Much firmer ground. It's an internal psychological tool of inference alone. That's a decent argument. And he knows that. That's why he said extant to the human being. It's not a coincidence. That's a carefully chosen word that he got from actual philosophy. Correct? Correct.
As well, I don't know, so therefore it'd be real.
All I'm trying to point out is he totally understands what's at issue here. He really does. If he's talking about a way to make it seem like he doesn't really understand the core question. Well, maybe Tyler Vela gave him the out. So maybe let's think of it that way. Maybe Tyler Vela gave him the out by structuring the argument too ambitious and gave him a lot of ground where he could just, squiggle around and make trouble. If you let Matt Dillahunty squiggle around, he's going to squiggle around. An argument has to stand or fall based on the quality of the argumentation alone. And in this context, Matt Dillahunty is perfectly within his purview to just not be convinced by hook or by crook. Dance out of the logical implications of the argument no matter what, by hook or by crook. If you can't catch him, the argument fails. You got to catch him. To catch us an atheist. He's got to be trapped by what? By the logical implication of the argument itself. No outs. You get it? It's complicated. I understand. Ron gets it. Ron, if you don't get it, listen to it twice. You will get it. All right, Ron's smart. Rachel Enns will get it too, and Dr. D will get it. There's a couple of people who get this stuff. It takes thought. It's not word salad. It takes thought. I promise. You have to really think. Play it over again and really think about what I said. Then you'll understand what I meant. Okay, it's not that complicated, but it is pretty complicated.
Really nice if God was there, which wasn't the argument that I made at all. That type of psychologizing.
You repeatedly dismissed the notion that it was okay to say I don't know, which
no,
I reject.
I didn't dismiss. I didn't dismiss it. It's okay to say I don't know. That's why I even gave the example that it might be permissible for you to remain a skeptic. That might be very good. But for someone who has a robust argument and evidence for something, your incredulity about something is not a defeater for it.
Right. So you have permission to remain a skeptic if you did not hear a quality argument about the reality of transcendent objects. Again, go back to the core question. What is the status of immaterial objects? Matt Dillahunty is still in the early stages of this. He kind of understands that there's an issue here. That's why he said extant to the human being, but he doesn't understand that this is a real issue for atheists. Why? Because he even in this video, even in this argument, acknowledges the reality of an immaterial object. Okay, it's got to be reconciled to atheism. Got to be. Has to be.
Right.
I can't reconcile it to atheism. Then atheism fails. Do you get it now? Then atheism is over. And it will one day vanish. Why? Because it can't be reconciled to the world as it actually occurs. Cannot be reconciled to the world as it actually occurs. Cannot be reconciled to real thought by real thinkers. Now, most of you atheists think, the Answers and Reason crew is actually humble. They don't think they're the smartest people in town. They're good thinkers. They're quality. They do thinking right. They do. They ask the right questions and they bounce things off and try and arrive at truth. They bounce ideas off of each other. So they do thinking correctly. That's why they usually get things, they arrive at a true idea. But most other atheists think they operate on the presupposition that they're the smartest person that ever was, that they're just so intelligent. It's unbelievable. I understand this, and theists are so dumb. They literally think like that. And most of them are freaking morons. It's amazing. Most of them are so dumb. And they literally think that that's why they're atheists. I think. Joe, check this one out. I don't know if Joe's listening. Joe, are you listening? No, it's Greg. All right, fine. No, not really. Tuned out a long time ago. Little word sound, Greg. You too, Joe? Yeah, word sound, Greg. All right, fine. It's not word sound, guys. I promise. It's word sound, Greg. Give it up. Give it up, Greg. Word sound. Stephanie, come on. It's word sound. It's word sound, Greg. Okay. This is the part where my wife tells me I'm going nuts. I swear to God, my wife will say to me 50 times a day, wow, you're demented, because I do weird things. Like, I just had two voices talking out of my head to me. Is that crazy? You're crazy. What are you doing? What are you babbling about? I'm doing weird stuff in the other room, ranting and raving, trying to get a rise out. Basically, I say things just to try and jerk a chain, drive her crazy. I swear to God, I do it like 50 times a day. No, actually 5,000. I do it a lot. Until she snaps. Not your mother, I'm not your sister. Then I back down for 5 minutes. Then I go out again. Just say crazy things to try and trip her out. Forever. Constantly. It's fun. All right, I apologize. What was I trying to say? What were we talking about? Where am I? Who am I? Why am I here? Most atheists think they're the smartest people in town. I swear to God. Do you know how many atheists get things just dumb wrong? Like wrong. And they'll argue with you like you're the dummy. You don't get it. I'm by definition 100 times smarter than you, Craig. Why? Because you're the theist. You're the dumb guy. Don't you get it? Stay in your lane, Craig. What? You're the dummy. I swear to God, they pretty much all but say it. Stay in your lane, Craig. What? You're supposed to be dumb. I'm supposed to be smart. That's why they're atheists. because they got automatic brain power. And yet they hear something like this and they go, word salad. Why? Because they don't understand it at all. Can't unpack it at all. Don't have any idea what these things are. Promise. Do you know how few, I can count on my hands, the atheists who can understand? I can tell you who they are. I know who the smart atheists are. So I've been around. I've seen them. You know, James Fodor can understand it. Nathan can sometimes, but Nathan can, but I don't know. He thinks he's right now. Nathan's in a phase right now. Maybe Nathan will grow out of it. We'll see. Or he just thinks he's by definition the smartest person who ever lived. And, you know, I understand everything so well. And he's just going to school everybody. And he doesn't even bother to learn things. Doesn't even bother to pay attention and read books. And, you know, he's doing a critique. Nathan, if you're listening, I apologize for bringing you up. But you did a critique of John Vervaeke, who has 50 videos on the meaning crisis. You stuck to the first video and you complained about something in the first video. And I don't think you ever got past there. Did you watch all 50 videos? If you didn't watch all 50 videos, stop complaining about John Vervaeke, please. Why? Because that's a common thing. You know, here's one thing I object to, therefore the whole thing's wrong. Atheists do that a lot. They find one objection. Oh, look, Pine Creek does that routinely. Oh, here's something Alyssa Childers said that's false. Therefore, Christianity is false. They do it all the time. Find one little thing wrong, and they draw an inference to everything, and you're supposed to play along. It's not how it works. Some of this stuff takes time. You can't understand it at first listen. You have to really wrestle with it in order to understand it. This is one of those things. This is why most atheists won't get this. Why? Because they don't effing care. They don't care. They don't care what's true at all. They don't care. They just want to show every flex on people and show how smart they are, and they aren't smart at all. Promise. For the most part, those debate me bros are morons. There's a couple. Dr. Matthew Hunt is the exception. That's why I kind of get a kick out of him. Because he's really intelligent. Obviously, he's wrong and he hasn't been trained in philosophy, and it shows, but he's a really intelligent guy. It also shows. Like, you can tell when you're dealing with someone who's actually intelligent, even though he said dumb, trippy things. Okay, that's because he does, but he's really smart. You know, Nathan's actually really intuitively intelligent too, obviously. You know, James Fodor's intelligent, Mind Onion's intelligent, the Answers of Reason crew. There's a whole bunch of atheists who are smart. But there's a whole bunch who float around on Twitter like Godless Liz who just think they're by definition smart. And they're kind of idiots. She's a little bit smarter than most of them. But I don't even think she could apply herself and understand this necessarily. That's my point. I don't think she could. And the guy who blocked me, double dumbass, who literally thinks he's like the smartest person who ever walked the face of the earth, I sincerely doubt he even understands that he can apply himself and understand this. Maybe if he took a class on it for a year, he could understand it. He couldn't do what Matt Dillahunty doesn't pick it up on the fly. Matt Dillahunty is genuinely intelligent, guys. He picks a lot of this stuff up on the fly. On the fly. That's really hard to do. Really hard to do. But so that in defense of his intelligence, but he doesn't know it well enough. Anyways, thus endeth the rant.
I didn't suggest it was. I'm wondering what the actual evidence is. But
Why?
You said God can create these laws.
No.
You did. I wrote it down as you said it. God can create these laws.
No, actually, I said that God can create the universe that coheres to those laws. I hold it as I'm an idealist, right? I think those.
Maybe I misspoke. Maybe I misheard. Whatever.
Yeah.
But
so
I wrote that down because it seemed really strange that someone would say God can create these laws because that suggests that he can change them.
Right.
But if God can't change them, then he's bound by them, which means they transcend God.
No, because if this is where I want to back up.
Okay.
Right? Because you properly said, and I get that's why I said in my own, let's ignore the semantics of saying nothing exists. we all get the problems with that.
Yeah. You and I both agree that's silly.
Yeah. But I know what you mean. This is where I was bringing up Nagel, right? Nagel was pointing out, well, natural explanations naturalism just fails epistemologically to ground all these transcendental facts of reality. It just